My practice as a curator is really focused on creating opportunities for artists, supporting artists and amplifying their voices and their vision and their practice through curating group shows. And I don't do it very often. I have a knowledge and network of Boston artists and New York artists and artists around the country that I work with, on occasion, every 5 years or something. I find an opportunity or a theme that I find compelling, and I really want to bring together the artists whose practice I know quite well, and artists that I know quite well, and I want to bring them together to put their work in context with one another around a theme. That excites me. So a few years ago, I curated a show at the Korean Cultural Center, and it was around the idea of contemporary artists who respond to all the various themes that are embedded in scholars' rocks, like the geology of rocks, the magic of rocks, it's the actual tradition of Far East Asian collecting practices in Korea or Japan or China. The shelves and the presentation and display, there's a lot of different themes embedded in scholars' rocks. So this theme makes an ideal group show because it can be so widely interpreted. I loved working with the artist. I loved hearing what the experience was like for them. Many of the artists had never thought about their work in the context of scholars' rocks, so it was great to begin dialogues and conversations with artists around scholars' rocks and the themes in scholars' rocks, and then bringing their work into context of one another. Some of the artists in the show were very familiar with scholars' rocks and grew up with traditions, Chinese traditions or Korean traditions of collecting and legacy and family collections of rocks. And some weren't. Some were from South America or had other connections, just backyard landscapes, rivers, stones that they hike through every day. So in a way, it seems like a very esoteric theme, but really, when you get right down to it, it's like we've all gone to a beach and picked up a rock and taken it home as a memento of our day at the beach. So it's also a very pedantic, relatable, accessible theme, and that's why I like the theme so much. My own career is as a woodcarver and a sculptor. I'm more knowledgeable about sculpture and the history of sculpture than I am of printmaking or painting. My own practice is creating feminist icons and different types of contemporary manipulation of traditional themes and scavenging for the heroines of humanity to celebrate in my work.
How I create one of these pieces is very much a exercise in walking around and seeing. I was just walking down, what is that, Tremont Street in Boston the other day, and I saw this great piece of asphalt, and it was like, pick me up, but it was too heavy. So I usually start there with a base, and then through my own sort of guilt about the environment, anytime I have to use a single-use plastic bottle or take it here to the studio, and then I cast it. And generally I'm trying to put that bottle on top or on the side of one of these I call them rocks, but they're not. There's chunks of asphalt or found cement. It's very much a sort of organic, intuitive process. I'm often thinking about bodies and how, sort of people might slump over something, and for me it's that weight of the again guilt of being a consumer, traveling, all of my personal carbon footprint, but I'm also thinking about how things might accumulate naturally in underwater or in a natural setting, how that things pull together. So I've only kind of recently become aware of scholars' rocks. I'm drawn to the idea that they are both, sort of universe and sort of this idea of like a perfect space, but also that it was found. So there's a similarity, and I am finding I'm drawn to something that feels like oftentimes a world. And this series called Sidewalk Series started with taking a piece of asphalt and making a little tree on top of it and a little gold leaf to represent a natural resource. So the project Sidewalk Series started with this idea of creating a sort of micro, macro sort of mini world. As it's evolved, it's now more about sort of balance and form and mixing these things that I see constantly in my very urban life. What fascinates me about Scholars Rocks is this idea that an artist or a person is tweaking something that's already naturally made and representing it in a new light. There's also all of the holes and crevices and just some of the formal aspects of especially concrete as it breaks up that I see in Scholars Rocks. I was going around, my street was being dug up, and I picked up a piece of asphalt and I said, well, this is public property. Like, I'm stealing, our shared resource. And I like the idea of putting in a little gold leaf to then make this thing become a commodity. So it's a privatization of public space. I do like this idea of this sort of very, what we think of as the precious artwork is just dug out of the ground, and with, my thumbprint becomes precious.
We are sitting with Stones on Stools, a series of compositions which are intersections of two collections. The collection of antique footstools or crickets from my late mother, who was an antique dealer and collector, and rocks from my collection. I created these in the period after my mother passed, was part of grieving, and I realized in doing so that growing up with my mother going to antique stores had trained me to look at things a certain way with an aesthetic eye. And she would always ask, looking at a chair or a stool, does it have the look? So when I was making these, I discovered very quickly that it's quite easy to put a rock on a footstool and have it not have a look or look like anything. Whenever I would find something that looked like it had a pop to it, I would hear myself asking my mother, does it have the look? Also, kind of a sidebar, I'm not sure that Paula would have liked these. I'm not sure that she would have thought that rocks belong on the stools. So I learned a lot about memory and grieving by doing these works. I found that digging in the earth, moving heavy rocks, but most of all doing these pieces was a very deep. Stone takes you to a place nothing else does. There's a stillness and a depth that gives you access to the depths that you need for grieving. I discovered Chinese scholar rocks through reading about them. The language of Taoism, stones are the bones of the earth. The rivers are its blood. In the rock the size of a fist is the power of 1,000 cliffs. I found the language that described the feeling I had of the energy of stones that drew me to stone. So I've always felt the earth pulled me, and stone is the medium through which I experience the earth. Stone is the medium of our life. Earthlings are geologic stone creatures. Life and biology comes much later. It all comes from stone. So when people ask me, do I think stones are alive? No, I think alive is stone.
When I'm going for a hike, I often think that it would be so cool if I could just lay down in the moss over here. That beauty in nature is so intense and so soothing. Like, you want to take it with you, but there's no way to do that, you know. And so it's funny that I'm making an imitation of nature, but I am trying to bring in this sense of comfort. I'm also trying to address how we treat nature. And I work with all found and repurposed fabrics. The average person produces about 82 pounds a year of fabric waste, of clothing waste. I'm interested in that dichotomy of time, of fast fashion, and the slow time of sewing has this really interesting echo with the slow pace of nature's growth. Sometimes you can still see the evidence of the knit, and so the hint of a cuff. I like that sort of play where the sweater is evident as you come to look closer. In some of the fiber I dye, so some of these rocks there, I do a rust dyeing process using rusty nails. I use vinegar and water and let them soak overnight. And then I rinse it with tea, and the tannins in the tea create the gray, and the iron ore of the steel creates the red of the rust, and then you get this beautiful rock-like texture and color. But most of the other colors are original of the sweaters. When I first started looking at some of the scholars' rocks more in depth, I also noticed the attention to detail of the pedestals that were made for the scholars' stones. I was interested that I had already been working with this small elevated landscape in terms of creating this Victorian footstool that elevated the landscape in the same way. I got very excited about making a chair that integrated the landscape in the way that the scholar stones do.
So I was thinking of the flow of water as the force that erodes the scholar's rocks. And so I kept water in mind, the energy of water. I think that immediately made me think of cyanotype when I was, as a medium, as I was thinking about this, creating this body of work. And not only that, but I think the white and blue in cyanotype kind of reminds me of China porcelain. I was thinking of how the body of work was evolving and time, and also fate. In Chinese mythology, there is a invisible red line that ties us to the people around us. And so I thought about that and started using thread. I had never used it before, actually, in my work, but I feel like it served as a nice flow. I feel like I'm breaking new ground for my work. Like for this one, for example, it's completely new and experimental for me. I actually took like Chinese calligraphy landscape techniques for the mountains here, this part, and I actually took lessons from Jack, and I learned these techniques from him. I'm also coming from being a Chinese American in the diaspora. Like I'm not really traditionally trained in any of the Chinese traditions, I feel. So I think a lot of that is in this work. The fortune cookie being the repetition in all these scrolls embodies my perspective as a Chinese American. I mean, everybody loves fortune cookies, right? I mean, they're lighthearted, they're fun, and I thought about how, hey, that is actually a completely American invention, the fortune cookie. So I just kept on thinking about it as a symbol of being Chinese American. And so I wanted to do something with that, and I photographed a series of abstracts involving fortune cookies, and I was like, I could use these as kind of a texture background in these scrolls. And so here they are.
This piece is called Table of Contents, and I originally made it for a show that I had at BU's, and I wanted to make something that would look at pieces or would consider pieces not in their full finished state, would think about the process, but also the importance of like work that's at rest and work that's in storage, work that's not, it's not just the idea of it just being in progress, but it is like what happens when it's not necessarily like active as part of a whole. That also paid homage to my studio in some way, thinking about the idea of the workbench, but also a display case. And I have these in my studio. I have these like really large, like a shelving unit. I had this idea that I would actually take those down and put those as the display case in the show itself. So I took them apart, I like remade them. And so this is where this piece came apart, and they come apart into sections. They've got these threaded inserts, but that way they can like become a bench, they can stack up and become something taller. And then what's on them are fragments of, most of them are finished work, some of them are things that didn't end up being part. Like they just were thoughts that didn't go anywhere, or they're like on pause or on hold. And so their ideas, the idea is that it's like giving them a place of rest, but that's like on display at the same time, like a display for the rest. I was thinking about, when you approached like me with this show idea of scholar rocks, and that idea of taking something out of its natural place, its natural state, and there's a bit of like discovery to that, this idea of discovering it, and then just through an intentional moving of it to give it a new location, to put it on display, or to intentionally put eyeballs on it, that somehow changed its function. That like what it's in relationship to around, whether it's the environment or like somebody's desk, or of course we go into a museum, that all of those locations, domestic or public or private, are like changing the content of the work, or it's basically how it's functioning. And I thought that was kind of interesting, that maybe the piece itself hadn't changed, the actual thing, what it's made of. There isn't necessarily, let's say, like the rock that's been gone into and carved again, but it is, you are altering, or the artist's hand is at work through the intentional location or dislocation of something. So that, I think, with the display and that choice to put it in conversation with other fragments or items that weren't intentionally or originally supposed to go together, I think is how I think it's reflected in this piece. Like, or at least I see that synergy.
My introduction to Scholars Rocks was Professor Bogosian said that I might find them interesting. And I don't know why. I think he just found them interesting, but I did. I like carving wood. I like Scholars Rocks. I like the shapes and forms. I'm not all that interested in the rocks themselves. I never was. My father was a geologist, but I was never a geologist. I was way more interested in looking at the way the water tumbled across the rocks, and the way that leaves floated over the water and collected in little places and made shapes. I just never really fell in love with what mineral it was. It was just a pretty rock. The shape of my sculptures is very much within the Scholars Rock tradition. I look for the colors of the wood, and then I augment the colors of the wood. I'm trying to find that in-between spot where my idea of form, what I see in the world, responds to what's in the wood, what the wood is giving me, and I can trace that form until it comes alive for me. I was trained by people who had a great understanding of abstract art. That was the period of time that I was being educated. And so to me, form, balance, line, the way things flow from one thing to the next, they're very important. I kind of came to the conclusion that a lot of what I was being taught was impersonal, cold. Most Scholars Rocks on the market today are deeply manipulated natural geology. That was not traditionally the approach. I met a great Korean collector who really spoke of the stone being an exploration event. They would find the perfect stone and it would become their home stone. He felt very strongly that there was a top and a bottom, that the stone, when it came out of the earth, needed to go in that configuration. And this idea of stone collecting and representation, I think there's a nice intersection there between art, rock, philosophy, poetry, and the person.
What's my relationship to rocks? I kick them as I walk. That's one of the earliest childhood memory. When you play hopscotch, there's always a rock involved. And we skip rock on the river. That is more personal relationship with rocks. You see those literati paintings of 山水. 山 is the mountain, 水 is the water. So 山 is the mountain / the rocks. A lot of those paintings, the scholar have to learn mountain from looking at a rock, physically observing a rock and imagining that as a mountain. So rock is important for every Chinese person. In the Palace Museum in Taipei, what are the 2 most wanted items for the visitors? 2 rocks. A green rock looks like a cabbage, and a brown rock looks like a piece of pork. And they are not that precious in terms of value, but they are the 2 most popular items for visitors to see. You ask why. So a lot of Chinese art is so nuanced, full of stories and references. But these 2 pieces of rock, it is what it is. It's a cabbage and it's a piece of pork. But more importantly, we have this scholar rock tradition, which is the fine art tradition, Chinese fine art tradition. Look at that tradition of appreciating scholar rock. You appreciate the folds, the holes, the textures, and the way it stands, and how it might look like. Oh, that looks like an eagle. That looks like a pig. Imagining a world within a world and beyond the world, and started from staring at a piece of rock.
I think I've always been interested in rocks as a kid, collecting rocks. I grew up in Taiwan, and I just learned how people collect them and display them, and how there's certain qualities that make certain rocks more desirable than others. I was always kind of interested in them as a thing because they would often be displayed on these specially made wooden pedestals. I somehow started making these closed shapes from all my leftover fabric pieces, kind of take a couple of corners, stitch them up, and to me they looked like stones. But what I wanted to try and bring into these shapes were holes. And I've always been obsessed with cutting holes in fabric. In the Chinese scholar rock tradition, perforations, the holes, there are qualities about that that are highly valued. I think that my interpretation of the qualities of what a scholar rock connoisseur might be attracted to is sort of filtered and abstracted through my own experience. So these are actually screen grabs from a cartoon I used to watch on Saturday mornings as a child. When the opening credits came on, I was like, oh my gosh, these are such amazing shapes. that's going to be my next series of sculptures. But do I want to do it in, my new favorite material? Or keep going with the possibilities of the fabric? And because it's just paper and glue, if it does tear, you just bend it. I could really just fold it up and put it into a tote bag or like squeeze it under my arm. And then it kind of just comes back. I think it's just a simple shape that's really gratifying, that has universal appeal, and it's understandable. I don't know what else to say about mountain ships.
So this is a work in progress in terms of the two shows that I'm having. I'm having an exhibition in New York City at the New Fine Arts called From Rock to Cloud, is an installation of scholar rocks. So it's in the air because I'm having scholar rocks at the New York Gallery. I'm having scholar rocks in your exhibition. And then the Davis Art Museum is also having an exhibition on scholar rocks, which I am participating in. For the art complex, some of the pieces will be the geological rocks, and others will be the handmade porcelain rocks. This whole body of work started when I was about 5 years old, I think. And I would take walks with my grandparents in early evenings, and that was the time that I would collect things that I found on the ground. So I was very attracted to rocks even back when I was 5. And my grandfather made a shelf for me to place these found objects. And when you do that, when you place something that you've found in an important location, then they have a different significance than if you just put them in a corner or in your drawer or so, right? Now you've elevated that rock to a sight line that you can imagine and see, think about daily. Throughout my life, I've always been collecting rocks or things that I have found that appeal to me. I have, over the many, many years, corners of rocks tumbling down. About 10 years ago, I started thinking of them as scholar rocks. I think of the rocks that I've been making as both a symbol and a bridge. It's symbolic of a certain history, Chinese historical, cultural history of collecting and of scholar rocks in particular. And then also as a bridge to contemporary life. And now I've brought all these rocks into this century, into this time in my life, and I wanted to figure out how to represent them. So the other way that I've been doing this is making scholar rocks through ceramics. And ceramics is, when you fire them, they transform into a whole another solid. So this transformation is really important because it also talks about remaking, migration, being here, and finding a whole new transformative identity in contemporary life.
Yeah, for literary paintings, we don't really do resemblance of the object. We do the image from our heart. Of course, we learn from the nature. We learn from the ancient master. The biggest master is yourself. The artist should believe what's the beat in their own heart. Try to show your own image. Even try to build up your own language. I learned from the master, especially I learned from the calligraphy artist, the sage of calligraphy, Wang Xizhi, or another great artist in Tang Dynasty, Yan Zhenqing. They are the divine figure in my heart. I try to copy from them, try to learn their spirit. I have spent many years in the West. I learned the West art deeply. I admire the Western artist. So I try to combine the two languages. Maybe it's a very brave steps. I try to combine even the two materials. I use ink, brush, because I do calligraphy from when I was very young. I also do the art on canvas. So I try to mount the rice paper on canvas. So I do the both art. Because I try to get the best from the East and combine with the best from the West. In the Song Dynasty, there's one famous calligraphy artist, his name Mi Fu. He loved scholar rocks so much. He tried to bow to each rock he loved, he admired, because he believes there's something divine inside that, and something deeper in the universe concentrated in that rock. We, as an artist, we see the stone, we see the scholar rock is something, a beauty from the nature. Probably it's one of the best gifts the heaven can give to a person